Hello guys, welcome back to my channel, guys and gals, of course. Today I'm gonna talk about SARMS, which most teenagers aged between 15 to 17 promoted on TikTok, on social medias like TikTok. So I assume that most of you wonder what is SARM and how it works and whether it builds muscle or not. And today we're gonna discuss it. So, SARM stands for Selective Androgen Receptor Modulators. They are called modulators because of SARMS. Effectiveness of SARMS pushed researchers to come up with SARMs that have selectivity for certain tissues, such as agonism for certain tissues and antagonism, the opposite of simulation, for the others. For example, tamoxifen, which is a SERM that gets prescribed millions of hormone sensitive breast cancer patients for blocking the estrogen stimulatory input on breast tissue. So tamoxifen acts like an estrogen, pretty much acts like an estrogen for bone marrow, but it also blocks the estrogen's actions on the breast tissue. So it simulates bone marrows to produce blood, erythropoiesis and hematopoiesis, but at the same time it blocks the stimulatory input of estrogen by blocking the estrogen receptors. So estrogen cannot stimulate those tissues. So the real question we have to ask is whether SARMs act that way or not. And the answer is unfortunately not, at least for now. Because remember, certain androgens have selectivity too, like primobolan, like masteron, like nandrolone. They are much more selective than testosterone. Like they have the myotropic to androgenic ratio is much more preferable than testosterone. So SARMs are very tissue selective in the research in low doses, but they lose their selectivity. Also, SARMs don't have antagonistic and agonistic tissues on different tissues. They are just selective androgen receptor simulators, and that's all. Pretty much that's all. If we use the analogy of a key and keyhole, like androgens activate the androgen receptors with a key, if we use that same analogy and apply it for the SARMs either works like a master key that opens multiple doors, which means that they can open a door with a key that doesn't belong to that door, or they are literally a lock picking tool that gains access, opens the door without you having a key. You can gain access. So another, you might so call it an issue, is highly binding affinity of SARMs to androgen receptors. This also is an interesting thing because most people cannot realize or cannot think whether the certain gynecomastia and other pseudoestrogenic issues where they come from. The possible explanation is this. Some people can experience gynecomastia and pseudogyno, a so-called pseudogyno, in the beginning of this so-called SARM cycle. Let's say they're gonna use it for 6 weeks or 8 weeks. SARMs bind to androgen receptors much more tighter than your endogenous testosterone. And SARMs don't bind to estrogen receptor either. But in the beginning of the SARM cycle, you also have your endogenous production. And your endogenous production naturally converts to E2, estradiol. But when you tightly bind, when the stuff you consume, the SARMs bind to androgen receptors, your endogenous testosterone cannot bind easily to androgen receptors. So what happens next? Your testosterone converts to DHT and estrogen much more than it naturally has. So you have much more estrogen conversion. That's the possible explanation. So also I gotta mention that you might have seen that sometimes trenbolone, so-called toxic, super toxic drug that everybody loves to use, everybody loves to talk about, is sometimes referred as a steroidal SARM. You might think about why. Why do they refer it as a steroidal SARM? The reason is, there are multiple reasons, but primary reasons are: one, trenbolone really tightly binds to androgen receptor, much more tighter than, much more stronger than your natural, your primobolan, your masteron, and your testosterone. Also, there is a reason too why it is also referred as steroidal SARM. The anabolic androgenic index has some flaws, has some problems that I also have addressed in a different video. But let's accept that for 1 second, that anabolic to androgenic index, anabolic to androgenic ratio is completely true, just for a second. And if we apply the values, the real world values of the trenbolone, like anabolic to androgenic index, just apply it for a second, like imaginary thing. It's an imaginary thing for arbitrary numbers. It would be probably like 1 to 0.75 ratio would be that, like 100 to 75, 100 anabolic and 75 androgenic ratio. Also, it's so-called that most of the time it's referred as non-tissue selective. Trenbolone is mentioned non-tissue selectivity on many sites. Also, anabolics book of William Llewellyn. But historically, it's used on breast cancer. It's used on females, and it's also has been used in the past for muscle wasting diseases. They find that it was somewhat tolerable for females in lower doses. So give it a thought. Trenbolone, the most toxic, the drug, the androgen that has 500 to 500 anabolic to androgenic reading, so it's super toxic, non-selective. But in the low doses, it seems like it is quite tissue selective, and we have research that show that in certain doses, it is actually more tissue selective than testosterone. So both SARM cycling ideas has some its flaws. In order to get extra conversion of testosterone to, in order not to get extra conversion of testosterone to estrogen and DHT, there is actually only 2 methods that commonly use or can be used, and those are One, you only have to use lower dose of androgens as a baseline, like a TRT dose, and on top of that, you then add SARMs. The higher dose you take, less tissue selective the drug behaves. That's the problem, the primary problem of the first method. And also, if you somewhat try to get steroid-alike effects, like steroid-alike myotropic effect, from the blood works I've seen so far, you get worse lipid profile. Your blood panels, actually your panels look worse than using actual steroids for the same myotropic effect, for the same desired myotropic effect. The second method is, it's actually somewhat ridiculous. Just increasing primarily the androgen dose, and on top of that, using low doses of SARMs. But it has some limitations, and I'm gonna mention why it's something stupid. It's really stupid to use LGD. Think about that. Would adding 1 to 5 milligrams of LGD 4033 would it make any significant difference while already using 7 milligrams per kilogram of androgens per week? Androgens are much powerful than SARMs, and think that you somewhat or yourself already using 7 milligram per kilogram of androgens per week. Would it really make difference to add like LGD? Would you really even feel, or have something that's even significantly different than the androgen alone? Why wouldn't you use, just instead of adding that, why wouldn't you use 8 milligrams, right? 8 milligrams per kilogram. Also, imagine a female physique competitor who has to put on serious muscle tissue, and then for some reason she decides that she has to use SARMs in order to have her desired physique, to achieve that physique. She might have some increased androgenic side effects because of the decreased tissue selectivity. Also, while certain androgens have higher tissue selectivity, they still can cause masculinization too. SARMs can masculinize you. Also, androgens can too, but you can almost like calculate the risks of androgens because they have been studied for almost like 80 years, and for SARMs you somewhat know the previous 20 years, and we have no data. We don't have as much data as we have on testosterone with SARMs, unfortunately. The only scenario where would using SARM is a very risk averse females that don't want to have androgenic side effects, but also they don't also at the same time they don't want to add so much muscle tissue. They might want to, let's say, 1 to 2 extra pound of stage weight. Let's say that's all they want to have. That's their goal. So in that case, in my experience, that's the only strategic use of SARMs. Till we have a SARM that has antagonistic properties on certain tissue, such as prostate and scalp, we don't actually have SARMs. They are just androgen receptor activators. that over time with the increased dose, they just lose selectivity. They are androgen receptor activators that lose selectivity with higher doses. With the in pictures, you can see from the research that testosterone's stimulatory effect on prostate and levator and myotropic and androgenic effects. You can see that at up to some point, this stimulatory myotropic the androgenic ratio was actually 2:1, but it lost the tissue selectivity. But if you take a look at the SARM so-called S23, you can see that after 0.3 milligrams per kilogram, it literally becomes much more prostate stimulatory. So it literally, while it behaved much selective than the while it behaved much more selective than the S23 up to a point, after 0.3 milligrams of kilogram, it stopped being selective whatsoever.